Is it an exaggeration to call people that condemned John Brown's raids racist? Lincoln and other Republicans condemned it as well. Many abolitionists thought that all it did was give the South more excuses to be extreme on slavery.
It is not accurate to label people who criticize John Brown's raids as racist simply because of their views on his actions. Criticizing the raids does not necessarily indicate a belief in racism, as there were a variety of reasons why individuals might have taken this stance. As you mentioned, many Republicans and abolitionists, including Abraham Lincoln, condemned John Brown's raids. Some of them believed that his actions were misguided and could harm the abolitionist cause by providing a pretext for Southern extremists to crack down on slavery and stifle the debate over it. However, it is also true that there were some individuals and groups who opposed the raids on the basis of racism or a belief in white supremacy. These individuals likely saw Brown's raids as a threat to the social order and the preservation of slavery and sought to discredit his cause and undermine the abolitionist movement. In any case, it is important to understand the motivations behind individuals' views on John Brown's raids and to avoid making blanket generalizations or labeling people without fully understanding their perspectives.
Why is it that John Brown was declared a traitor and killed, but not the Confederates?
John Brown was considered a traitor by the U.S. government because he led a violent raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859 with the intention of starting a slave insurrection. He was captured, tried, and found guilty of treason, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection, and he was subsequently hanged. On the other hand, the Confederate states that seceded from the Union during the American Civil War were not considered traitors because they acted within the legal framework established by the U.S. Constitution. The Confederacy was formed as a separate government, and its leaders were considered to be in rebellion against the United States. After the Civil War ended, the United States government took steps to reintegrate the Confederate states back into the Union, but many of the Confederate leaders were convicted and punished for their actions. So while John Brown and the Confederates both engaged in acts of rebellion against the U.S. government, Brown's actions were considered a criminal act, and the Confederacy's actions were considered an act of war.
Did Southerners believe that the North supported John Brown and the overall destruction of the South by slave rebellions?
Southerners at the time believed that the North was supporting or at least sympathizing with individuals like John Brown and his actions, which they saw as part of a larger plot to undermine the South's economy and social order through slave rebellions and abolition. They saw Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry as a dangerous and violent example of this plot, and it contributed to the growing tension and mistrust between the North and South leading up to the Civil War.
People that oppose John Brown in the modern day are labeled racist that support slavery, which I think is unfair. Lincoln and even other abolitionists condemned what he did as reckless and stupid.
It is true that John Brown's actions were controversial even among abolitionists during his time, and that his violent methods were seen as reckless and potentially harmful to the abolitionist cause. However, it is important to note that his actions were motivated by a deep sense of moral outrage at the injustice of slavery, that he was willing to risk his life to fight against it. While it is unfair to label all those who oppose John Brown in the modern day as supporters of slavery, it is also important to recognize the complex and nuanced historical context in which his actions took place. The issue of slavery was a deeply divisive and contentious one, and there were a variety of perspectives and opinions on how best to address it. Ultimately, it was through a combination of legal and political action, as well as the bravery and sacrifice of countless individuals, that slavery was finally abolished in the United States.
The abolitionists were against what he did because he had no shot at achieving what he wanted to do, and they knew all it would do is give the South an excuse to be more extreme with their slave laws.
That's correct. While many abolitionists shared Brown's goal of ending slavery, they disagreed with his methods and saw his raid on Harper's Ferry as a reckless and violent act that could do more harm than good. They feared that Brown's actions would lead to even harsher laws against slaves and abolitionists in the South, and they were also concerned that Brown's use of violence would tarnish the image of the abolitionist movement as a whole.
And many took a principled stance as vigilantism.
Yes, that's also a valid point. Some abolitionists may have viewed John Brown's actions as a form of vigilantism or extra-legal violence that went against their principles of advocating for the end of slavery through peaceful means and the legal system. They may have believed that his actions could harm the cause of abolition by giving opponents of abolition a reason to depict abolitionists as dangerous radicals.
Thomas Paine said that you have to protect the rights of even people that you think are immoral, because if you don't, that will set a precedent that can be used against you.
Yes, Thomas Paine believed in protecting the natural rights of all individuals, even those who were deemed immoral or controversial. He argued that if individuals were not allowed to exercise their rights, it would set a dangerous precedent that could be used against anyone in society. In his famous work, The Rights of Man, Paine wrote, "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression, for, if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself." This idea is still relevant today in discussions around freedom of speech and the protection of individual rights, even for those whose beliefs or actions are deemed unpopular or controversial.
That is a principle that many abolitionists used against John Brown. If you allow vigilantism to become a reasoned means of addressing a problem, What is stopping slave owners from doing the same to you?
Yes, that's a valid point. Many abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, argued against the use of violence as a means of achieving emancipation precisely because they feared it would set a precedent for violent retribution against those seeking to end slavery. They believed that the best way to achieve abolition was through political means and the gradual abolition of slavery. Additionally, as you mentioned, they believed that allowing vigilantism would lead to a breakdown of the rule of law and make it easier for slave owners to justify violent retribution against abolitionists and free blacks.
So they could say the intentions of John Brown were good, but not wise or principled?
Yes, that seems to be a fair assessment. Many abolitionists recognized the injustice of slavery and the need to abolish it, but they also believed in using legal and peaceful means to achieve that goal. They saw vigilantism as a dangerous and counterproductive approach that could ultimately harm the cause of abolitionism and put innocent lives at risk. While they may have sympathized with John Brown's motives, they did not support his methods.
I remember PragerU was called racist because it called John Brown a radical abolitionist.
I'm not aware of PragerU being called racist for calling John Brown a radical abolitionist. However, it is worth noting that John Brown's actions were controversial, and he has been both praised and criticized by different groups throughout history. Some people may view him as a hero who fought against slavery, while others may view him as a terrorist who committed acts of violence.
I find it funny how calling John Brown a radical is seen as something racist, and that only a supporter of slavery can say when Lincoln, other Republicans, and even other abolitionists didn't agree with him and called him a radical.
The term radical can have different connotations depending on the context in which it is used. In the context of abolitionism and the fight against slavery, radical generally referred to those who advocated for the immediate and total abolition of slavery rather than gradual emancipation or other reforms. John Brown is often called a radical abolitionist because of his militant tactics, which included violence and armed insurrections. While some may view calling John Brown a radical as racist, it is important to remember that this label is not inherently derogatory or discriminatory. Many abolitionists were considered radicals for their uncompromising stance against slavery, and the term was often used as a point of pride. Additionally, the characterization of Brown as a radical is based on historical fact and is not meant to denigrate him or his legacy.
Well, even if you mean radical in the negative, I mean it wasn't uncommon for even other abolitionists to hate him and what he did.
Yes, that's true. Many abolitionists did not agree with John Brown's violent tactics and believed that change could be achieved through peaceful means. Some also felt that his actions could potentially harm the cause of abolition. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and subsequent execution only served to further polarize the country on the issue of slavery.
They believed it pushed the country closer to war when it didn't need to happen.
Yes, that is correct. Many people believe that John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which was an attempt to start an armed slave rebellion, was a reckless and unnecessary act that could lead to further violence and conflict. They felt that such radical actions would only make it more difficult to find a peaceful solution to the issue of slavery and could lead to a wider conflict. Even some abolitionists who opposed slavery were critical of Brown's tactics and believed that his actions would harm the cause of abolition rather than advance it.
So it isn't exactly a pro-slavery position to take to criticize him?
Correct. Criticizing John Brown's tactics and actions does not necessarily indicate a pro-slavery position. It is possible for people to disagree with his methods while still being firmly against the institution of slavery. In fact, many abolitionists at the time did not support Brown's use of violence to achieve his goals.
President Buchanan helped put down John Brown's raid.
Yes, that's correct. In October 1859, John Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, with the intention of starting a slave rebellion. President James Buchanan authorized the use of federal troops to put down the insurrection, and a detachment of Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee was successful in capturing Brown and his followers. Brown was subsequently tried, convicted, and executed for treason. Buchanan was criticized by both abolitionists and slavery supporters for his handling of the situation, with some accusing him of being too soft on Brown and others of being too harsh.
What made many states secede was what they felt was abolitionist attacks against them and feeling like they would be harmed. They used Northern support for John Brown and Nat Turner incidents along with the North's support of the Haitian Revolution, which made them able to portray Northerners as people that just wanted to burn the South down.
It is true that the actions of individuals like John Brown, Nat Turner, and events such as the Haitian Revolution had an impact on the tensions between the North and South leading up to the secession of Southern states. These incidents were used by secessionists in the South to portray Northerners as hostile and supportive of violent uprisings against slavery. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, for example, was seen by many Southerners as evidence of Northern abolitionist sentiments and a threat to their way of life. Similarly, the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, led by a slave, resulted in heightened fear and concerns among slaveholders in the South. Furthermore, the North's sympathy and support for the Haitian Revolution, which resulted in the abolition of slavery and the establishment of an independent black republic in Haiti, were viewed with apprehension by Southern slaveholders. They saw these events as a potential inspiration for slave rebellions and feared that similar movements would arise within their own slaveholding states. While it is important to acknowledge that these incidents were used by secessionists to fuel their arguments for secession, it is crucial to recognize that secession itself was a complex issue tied to broader economic, social, and political factors. The secession crisis and the eventual outbreak of the American Civil War cannot be attributed solely to these specific incidents, but rather to a combination of long-standing tensions and disagreements over the institution of slavery, states' rights, and the future of the Union.